What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? The lectionary today provides one of the most familiar half verses in the entire Old Testament. But what's the rest of the story? The context. It starts by God telling the people, if you have a problem with me, please tell me. God tells them to take their contentions to court. And then God invites in a jury. Tell it to the mountains and the hills, the eternal foundations of the earth, and let them decide the verdict. That's the setting. Then watch as God lays out a defense. God pleads, what have I done to you? Please, how have I wearied you? It's not the voice of an angry God who demands an answer. It's the voice of a God who agonizes and is filled with sorrow. You notice God doesn't complain or say that they're wrong. God doesn't deflect and instead accuse them of unfaithfulness. God simply replies by asking the people to remember their history. Deliverance from slavery in Egypt. To remember Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, a notable and striking reference to a female leader of the people. God tells them to remember what is an obscure reference to us, but was obviously memorable at the time. Remember that you were delivered from the Moabite king Balak. And to remember the final crossing of the Jordan River, camping at Shittim on the east side, and then Gilgal on the west side, on the other side of the river. God lays out all this defense without defensiveness, without animosity or blame, calmly. In sharp contrast, the responding party from the people explodes and blows everything out of proportion. What do you want from us? And goes into a litany of the most preposterous examples he or she could imagine. Animal sacrifice was a way to honor God. It was an offering, for example, of a sheep or a ram. But the lawyer for the people asked, what do you want? Would 1,000 rams be enough for you? So imagine you've lent $10 to a friend who promises to pay you back by the end of the week. Months later, you finally ask your friend if you can have your money back. I'm sorry to ask, but could you? But instead of being embarrassed, apologetic for having forgotten to pay you back, they respond, I suppose you want interest from me too. What do you want? $10 million? Will that be enough to finally satisfy your greed? That's the answer from the lawyer for the people. Will 1,000 rams be enough for you? How about not just one jug of oil, but rivers of oil? How about my firstborn child? Will that be enough to finally satisfy you? You see, it's rant, rave, and deflect, and now you're the bad guy. It's an unnecessary litany of increasingly absurd defenses. Yeah, you see where it's going. It's like rants and raves and deflections of increasingly absurd defenses offered by lawyers for the president. From he did nothing wrong to everyone does it, so get over it, to anything the president does by definition is not wrong. Or the more reasonable explanation, it's wrong, it's just not wrong enough. Which I have to admit, I might agree. If sexually assaulting multiple women isn't bad enough, this is nothing. If ripping children from their mother's arms and placing them in cages isn't bad enough, well, this does in fact pale in comparison. Another litany of increasing absurdity, absurd that any of it is okay. I'll be honest with you, I haven't been able to watch the impeachment trial, barely a few minutes here or there, just enough news coverage to feel like I had a sense of what happened that day. Well, this week I read a blog post by John Pavlovitz, the author we invited to speak here last year. And it felt so spot on, I feared he had entered my dreams and taken dictation. Back in September, which emotionally feels like 10 years ago, long before the events of the past week, Pavlovitz said, "I used to believe that our system of checks and balances would protect us from overreaching parties and presidents. I used to believe decency would win the day because our shared humanity was something we were all interested in protecting. I trusted that people would eventually do the right thing. But I no longer believe those things. I no longer believe our leaders will choose country over party. I no longer believe truth matters to everyone. I no longer believe the American church is a source of moral leadership because I've witnessed the Franklin Grahams and Jerry Falwells of the evangelical right sink deeper and deeper into the putrid cesspool of their political bedmaking. And as a result, I realized they're not going to protect the air we breathe or the water we drink because money, too much money, is at stake. And they're not interested in stopping gun violence or stopping mass shootings because guns are too profitable and necessary to create anxious fear. And they have no intention of protecting marginalized and vulnerable people. Black and brown people are just too useful for generating fear and as a tool to solidify white power than to risk letting people of color vote." Now there's more, but there's no need to read more of the stuff we all know all too well. These must be a dream. Real-life nightmares are exhausting. I'm trying to hang in there. How about you? But every time I think we must have reached the bottom drops out further. Yet as I'm writing this, I wonder if this isn't just the depression of the privileged. I'm used to thinking that things generally work out. But how often has the notion of the common good really been much more about the common good for people like me? With, a good job, a good education. I can show up at the doctor's office anytime I want because I have insurance. I have a passport to go anywhere in the world I want. And pension benefits that's better because of a strong stock market. And I'm white. Things have generally been pretty good. Better than for most. And I have to admit, the idea that Americans have had shared values in the past, and this is just an aberration, reveals my privilege and my ignorance. I remember back to something I said in my first sermon after the election. Deshaun Mosley asked, what was wrong with white progressives? How could you be surprised? How couldn't you see that this would happen every time African Americans get a little closer to equality? A wave of white resentment comes hurtling around the bend to wash all the progress away. Columnist Leonard Pitts described the election as a slapdown to women and people of color and LGBT folks. A vicious and painful reminder, so we'll know our place. So when I think our nation's diversity, increasing diversity, is a good thing, and start thinking that things will finally get better when the country becomes a minority majority, I need a dose of reality. Like that from Dr. Jennifer Richardson, who told the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the era of white anxiety is just beginning. She's a researcher who said tolerance likely won't increase, but rather an even more propulsive acceleration of depression from a historically white majority which will not quietly cede power. For example, the kinds of actions we are seeing today from white evangelical Christians who are both angry and fearful that their cultural dominance is passing from the scene, willing to do literally anything to debase themselves, to hold on to their power. Black History Month should remind us how this has happened over and over again throughout our country's history. Absurd and intentional acts of cruelty. But we also remember heroes and how many people have not only survived, but done such things as gone on to establish thriving businesses and colleges and so much more. Leonard Pitts added to his slapdown comments, "To those who wish to crush my spirit and the spirit of others like me, hear this: it will not work." And John Pavlovitz says exactly what the privileged need to hear, those for whom things have generally worked out. Stop trusting that the arc of the moral universe will simply bend toward justice. I've always liked the line that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Made famous by Martin Luther King Jr., but it's actually a line from a sermon by a Unitarian preacher in 1853. Pavlovitz interprets it for our time. Stop trusting that it will happen, leaving it to fate and chance, and instead decide to be arc benders. Stop trusting that the arc of the moral universe will simply bend toward justice. He said the only way things are going to be okay is if good people make them okay. That means people of faith must stop abandoning the conversation about religion to those who are loudest about their vision of exclusion. We have to push louder and harder against Christian supremacy, male superiority, and white nationalism. Progressive Christians must learn how to speak about our deeply held religious convictions, the reasons we are passionate about the common good. 2. Christians and atheists and Muslims and Jews and Sikhs and agnostics and Hindus and Buddhists and humanists and anyone committed to the common good must realize our combined power and offer a unified voice. 3. Progressives and moderates must realize that one election every 4 years isn't the way to make change to benefit the common good. It will take every person in every profession, every day, from students and teachers and bankers and bus drivers and those who have retired, every person in every profession, every day, deliberately working for the goal of shared prosperity, using whatever skill or gift or talent we have. And 4, frankly, it will take the 100 million people who didn't vote in 2016 to decide they give enough of a damn to register and show up. The question is now, who is going to register them? Now, this may all strike you as too hyperbolic, too exaggerated, too pessimistic. And in fact, it may start sounding like the lawyer for the people in today's reading from Micah. What do you want from us? 1,000 rams? What do you expect from us? Rivers of oil? What if we give up our firstborn children? Will that finally be enough to satisfy you? And then what does the prophet Micah say in response? He is the last to speak. So the jury has listened, God has spoken, and the people replied with increasing absurdities. And now the prophet says, God has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. That's the context, the rest of the story, from the 8th century BCE under King Hezekiah. Also happens to be the context of the 21st century CE under a different system, but so, okay, mortals, what does the Lord require of you? You already know what is good. Well, then as now, it's not as simple as we might like. It's not as easy as 1 ram or even 1,000. Then as now, it's not as simple as a jug of oil or even rivers of oil, and then as now, it's not as extreme as child sacrifice. But what is required is a change to the way of life for the privileged. Not to be hopers in ark bending, not an observer of ark bending or a commentator on the slowness of it. We must not let the absurdity of our country's defenseless cruelty and the lawlessness of our leaders go unanswered. So together we are going to bend the ark and do justice. We're not going to simply believe that our leaders will do what is right anymore. That's irresponsible. And we are going to love kindness. At this point, trusting that everything will work out. It's a fool's delusion. Now, of course, to be ark benders, that also means the sacrifice of our time and gifts and skills and talents and effort and money. We're not going to do it alone, however, but humbly with our God. With God and with our church family, learning how to be more articulate and proudly progressive Christians committed to the common good that is good for everyone. Amen.